Welcome, everybody. For those who don't know me, I'm Karen Makour. I'm the SPIA chair. And for those of you who have been to many of these, welcome back. Today is going to be the first of a new type of talk, because Berber will be presenting advances on an impact assessment, impact evaluation design that was discussed as part of the matchmaking workshop in Nairobi. Where we had a subset of initiatives, of the new initiatives, researchers kind of talking to external, mostly academic people interested in impact. And as some of you are aware, we have a second one of those coming up next week, in fact, in Cali. So this is excellent timing to see a first result of what has happened in a few months, but in particular, kind of the purpose of this is to be able to collectively learn from what's been happening, but also kind of give feedback early on and provide peer review of these designs, before they're getting launched or at the early phases to maximize input at that stage, which is when it's the most valuable. So very thanks for setting us off on this new journey, and looking forward to it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Karen, for that introduction. So I'm for today presenting the impact evaluation design of the Market Intelligence Initiative. This initiative, I'll talk in a little bit what it is about, but I thought it'd be nice to share with the group here today two examples or two studies that were developed as a result of the matchmaking workshop with both academic teams and CGIAR teams to show, what type of impact assessments we can be doing of the initiatives that hopefully are both rigorous if we pass this peer review today, but also relevant to, impact assessments of initiatives that might not always work directly with farmers, but maybe more at the institutional level. So with that, let me get started. Why do we have a market intelligence initiative? The motivation behind this initiative is that up to the recent past, investment decision-making in genetic innovation has often been fairly supply-driven or technology-driven. On top of that, we observe slow varietal turnover with farmers still growing varieties from, say, 10, 20 years ago, and varietal replacement going really slow. In addition, product profile design is often based on agronomic traits or stress-tolerant traits. And for instance, the main objective often might be yield improvement or improving drought and flood tolerance, but often less attention is paid to opportunities that breeding initiatives could have in other areas of impacts, for instance, nutrition or livelihoods, environmental health or gender equality. Then a challenge is being that social scientists who could provide more input on where breeding initiatives could have stronger impacts in those other areas. Social scientists and also national partners, they're often not sufficiently empowered in product profile design. So in the design of new varieties, what to breed towards, to really have input on saying, this is where we think impacts can be achieved. If we focus on these traits, then we could have stronger impact, say, on gender equality. That requires empowering social scientists and national partners. So that's one of the objectives also of the Market Intelligence Initiative. So how do we work? We have 5 work packages. The first work package is called Market Intelligence. And Market Intelligence looks at regional market segments that are defined by crop, by region or country, by different characteristics of crops that people might be growing in those regions. And it maps those with the 5 CGIAR impact areas and looks at, for instance, what number of people are malnourished in a given market segment, because that defines an opportunity through breeding initiatives to reduce malnutrition. And the size of that opportunity depends on the extent and the number of people malnourished in that market segment. And the same, for instance, for poverty or for gender inequality, challenges in climate change adaptation and environmental health. So it's mapping market segments into opportunities for having impacts in the 5 CGIAR impact areas. So that is what is happening in Work Package 1 based on forecasting methods, based on existing data that there might be on trends. So that's Work Package 1. Now this information is then fed into Work Package 2, which is called Product Profile Design, where product profiles are being developed, stating, for instance, what would we want to target for, say, yield as a trait? What would we want to target for insect resistance as a trait? Or what to target in terms of plant height, and how important are each of these traits in an upcoming breeding initiative or investment? And so in the product profile design, now the big change is that instead of focusing on regional market segments that have been defined by, say, crop or traits or crop characteristics in a given market segment, that also as transdisciplinary teams are coming together in the product profile design, that they have this information on what opportunities do we have in given market segments, and in which market segments are the opportunities for, say, reducing malnutrition or reducing poverty, in which market segments are those opportunities the largest. So that is what is happening in Work Package 2. Now, target product profile designs are fed into 2 other initiatives in the CGIAR action area for genetic innovation. This includes the Accelerated Breeding Initiative, where really the new varieties are being developed, and the Seed Equal Initiative that looks into now, once these varieties are released, how to get them into the market. Then we have Work Package 3, which is focusing on behavioral intelligence. What this work package is doing is it's saying, hey, even if we have varieties that have been informed by perfect market intelligence, that are matching farmers' needs and preferences, that are really introduced or developed for market segments where the opportunity for having impact was the greatest, this doesn't automatically mean that we have impact, because varietal replacement needs to happen. Farmers need to start growing these new varieties. Consumers need to start consuming the new products that are being grown. And so how to accelerate varietal turnover, how to get farmers and consumers to start using new varieties and products, that is the key question that we are asking through a range of experiments in Work Package 3. Now, with that, all these work packages, they feed into where really the final cost benefit analysis and the investment case is being made, and that is our Work Package 4. So Work Package 4 puts all the information together, has an investment dashboard that is showing for investors, for potential breeding pipelines, what the opportunities and the costs and benefits are projected to be, so that investors can make informed decisions based on market intelligence. And then finally, we have a work package, institutional scaling and NALIA. So the impact assessments that I'm presenting today are falling into that work package. So this is a snapshot of how the market intelligence initiative is operating and structured. Now for the NALIA, monitoring, evaluation, learning, and impact assessment, and particularly impact assessment, our goal is to generate evidence on the costs, the benefits, but also the comparative effectiveness of this new transdisciplinary approach to breeding, seed systems and investment prioritization. The goal really is to provide a proof of concept for this new approach, whereby market intelligence is being used to prioritize which breeding pipelines to invest in. And how are we doing this? So in our NALIA plan, in the original proposal, we had included 3 studies. One is focused on better understanding the process of change within breeding programs. And we proposed doing this using behavioral tools and institutional adoption studies. A second study would aim at forecasting how these changes will impact farmers and consumers across the 5 CGIAR impact areas. And for this, we were proposing to work with the impact model, which is developed by researchers at IFPRI. And then a final study would use randomized control trials to empirically test our assumption that once we have improved varieties and products that are informed by market intelligence, if these would be released, that will have greater impacts than the current practice of prioritizing investments in breeding, which might be more focused on maximizing yield gains and stress tolerance. So those were the three studies that we had in our original proposal that were most closely matched to impact assessment. And then we took two of these studies with us to the matchmaking workshop that SPIA was organizing in July 2022 here in Nairobi. So in this matchmaking workshop, what we did was we presented as the CGIAR researchers. We presented the initiative. Also, we shared initial thoughts on how we could see these two media studies that I just highlighted, with, you know, where we thought there was potential for collaboration with academics. Then what happened is, based on our initial presentations, SPIA organized in a matchmaking workshop speed dating with different academic teams and CGIAR initiatives, in which we had the opportunity to discuss the study in more detail. Teams would have questions about the initiatives or the media plans, so we would answer those and kind of start brainstorming already about potential designs to actually implement the studies. And then after that, both academic teams and CGIAR initiatives kind of ranked their preferred matches, and the top matches all were implemented. So then we had time between the kind of matched academic teams initiatives to co-create a study design there in the workshop itself, which was then presented at the end of the workshop. The matches that we established through this process, which we were really happy about, were with actually two academic teams for the two questions that we went into the workshop with. So from Tufts University, we were matched with Anne Kraan and Carl Emmerich, with Carl Emmerich being the advisor and Anne Kraan being a PhD candidate. And with them, we decided to collaborate on randomized trials to evaluate whether varieties that have greater impact or potential for impact based on market intelligence, whether these indeed have impacts at the farmer and consumer level. And also, there was a keen interest of bringing in a stronger emphasis on consumer-oriented interventions into these randomized trials. And so that will be one study that I'm presenting today. Another match that was established was with a team from the University of Bordeaux, Jeremy do Nascimento Miguel and Tanguy Bernard, with Jeremy being the PhD candidate and Tanguy being an advisor. So most academic teams that came to the workshop had a PhD candidate and an advisor. And so with them, we further worked out an idea of behavior experiments or lab in the field experiments, in which we will analyze how market intelligence can inform breeding programs, really to get at some of the institutional change. And it's important here to flag that the Market Intelligence Initiative really isn't working directly with farmers that much. And so whereas some other CGIAR initiatives might be looking more at impacts at the farm level as a direct consequence of their activities, in the Market Intelligence Initiative, the main end users are, say, breeders and breeding programs and social scientists in CGIAR institutions or in the NARES and national partners. And so we're looking much more at institutional change. But here we found an interesting way of learning about how could that institutional change occur. And so I'll first talk about that particular study. So this study is asking the question, does the initiative, the Market Intelligence Initiative, does it inform investments in breeding? And here our assumption is that we provide better market intelligence, that this may lead to a behavioral change in breeding programs, that there is more of an emphasis on the social returns in different impact areas that improved varieties might have, that this would lead to an accelerated supply of high quality breeding products that indeed target the CGIAR impact areas instead of primarily focusing on, say, yield gains or stress tolerance. That would then lead to variety release and to adoption. Now, testing that causal pathway, of course, takes much longer than the 3 years that we have currently in this initiative, hopefully with extensions into the future. But for now, we're planning around a 3-year cycle. And so because of this, we said, okay, let's use behavioral tools to really focus on the process of change within breeding programs. And in doing so, also documenting how this process of change is influenced by incentives or trade-offs that different actors in the target product profile design and in investment prioritization, the trade-offs that they face, and also team dynamics that might be at stake, with this idea that testing our assumption that indeed social scientists and national partners are often not as empowered in the breeding process as we would like for them to really have input on where impactful investment opportunities could lie. So how are we going to go about it? We started with literature reviews to better understand breeding programs, organizational structure, the incentive structure for breeders and trade-offs. And so this is something that after the matchmaking workshop, the academic team started collaborating on with us. We have been engaging in our kicked off discussions with breeder networks, in which we're looking for guidance on existing resources, tools, and databases that are important for us to implement the experiment. Also, we're engaging in discussions with other experts, working on similar themes, but from different disciplines. And finally, we're developing a guide for key informant interviews with breeders. So those are the things that right now we're working on together. But really importantly, let's move to kind of the current ideas that we have on the experimental design, because we'd love to have feedback on that. So what we are planning to do is to invite stakeholders, which includes breeders, both from the CGIAR and national partners, as well as donors, social scientists. So anyone who could be on these transdisciplinary teams that do target product profile design, or who are involved in investment prioritization, to invite them to participate in a study on how breeding investments are prioritized. The current idea is that then participants in the study will be presented with an incentivized task in which we will present them with a list of market segments and characteristics of the market segments in which normally they might want to focus on with the target product profile design. And then there's a trade-off, of course. Across the market segments, there will be variation in terms of some market segments might have a higher chance of a variety being released, or of it resulting to publications, which could be considered private returns, things that would be good from a breeding program perspective. But there's also there's a trade-off in terms of those that might have a higher chance of a variety being released or higher chances of publications might not necessarily be the market segments where the impact in CGIAR areas would be the greatest. And so whereas, for instance, the first set of market segments with a higher chance of a variety being released, maybe those are the ones where yield gains are more easily achieved. But to have impact in the CGIAR areas, maybe breeding programs should focus on other market segments. And so then in this experiment, in this incentivized task that participants are completing, we would randomize the type of information provided to the participants. In a control group, we would focus on the what and the where of a market segment and sort of, the status quo, describing a market segment in terms of the crops, the crop characteristics, the geographic location, maybe the number of people in that market segment. But then in the treatment, we would also add more characteristics on the who, the number of people in poverty, the number of people malnourished, maybe the extent of malnutrition, the extent of poverty, the extent of gender inequality, maybe underlying causes of that gender equality that could be addressed through genetic innovation, through varieties that have been developed more purposefully for women farmers, for instance. And then the big question is, does this type of information influence which market segments participants invest in? Now that's answering a question of, okay, is the information being used in a given incentive structure? And here the question is, okay, to what extent that we would like to learn about as part of our media components, to what extent does this ratio of private versus social returns, to what extent does that influence decisions? So if we would, for instance, make private and social returns perfectly aligned, the potential of impact in CGIAR areas is perfectly aligned with, say, the potential yield gains in a market segment and the chance of that variety being released. Do we see similar behavior as when the incentives don't align well with one another? Another question is, how do team dynamics influence this decision? And so for that, we'd group participants into teams and vary the team composition. For instance, whether it's a multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary team, or people from one discipline, whether the most senior person is from a breeding background or from a social science background, things like that. We could vary in order to learn about how do team dynamics actually influence which market segments the participants invest in this experimental task. Also varying, for instance, communication with other participants and looking at how that influences decisions made. So that is where we are now. In terms of the type of market intelligence that might be provided, we would like to build on market segments that have been developed by excellence in breeding. And the type of characterization that is there right now is mostly focused on what and where, as I mentioned. So for instance, it might list crop, region, and sub-region. In the market segmentation, also there's a distinction between how the crop is used and where the crop is grown, for instance, in the lowlands versus the mid or the high altitudes, what the crop color is, how the crop is grown, crop maturity. So you can see these are all more crop-related characteristics and not so much looking at the specific characteristics of the population and the potential to reduce, for instance, malnutrition or gender inequality in a given market segment. And so that gives us an opportunity to vary the type of additional information that we provide for these market segments, whereby we can say, okay, this is the number of people in a market segment, versus say, for instance, this is the number of people malnourished, or the number of people in poverty, or the number of women disempowered in a given market segment. And this is the type of information also that the Market Intelligence Initiative is aiming to provide in the investor dashboard. That is one of the main outputs of the initiative. So here's an example, or here's a list of the current market segments. You see that there's the existing set of market segments. Most of them are focused on rice, followed by maize and sorghum. And then as we go down, the number of market segments for a given crop reduces. You can also see to the right that there's actually 56 market segments that we have identified, or that the Excellence in Breeding Initiative has identified, for which there's no breeding pipeline currently. Now, those might include market segments where we would not want to be working as the CGIAR because there is limited potential for impact. But that is the type of information that the Market Intelligence Initiative could fill in. And then there's still some things with data gaps being sorted out. So you see that for 101 market segments that actually at the moment we don't know if it is actually mapped to if a breeding pipeline is mapped to that market segment. Now, a little bit more on the intervention. This is, for instance, the type of information that could be shown. Total population in poverty for different market segments listed, and ranking them in terms of the opportunity to reduce poverty through breeding towards a given market segment. Or you could show information on total population undernourished. And so the goal is to work closely with other work packages in the initiative that are actually preparing this information for target product profile design and for the investment case building that's part of our full work package, where there's an investor dashboard being generated. So to closely work with them and with the Excellence in Breeding initiative on what type of content to provide to participants as the market intelligence that we use as our main treatment. In addition, the foresight team from IFPRI is also involved in doing foresight analysis for different segments, and so we can be building on that information as well. So that was on the first study, designed in collaboration with the team from the University of Bordeaux. Now moving on to a second study. This study, and so the first study was focused more on the institutional change, because really all the work that we're doing is mostly at the institutional level, looking at do breeding decisions or does prioritization in breeding programs, does it change because of the market intelligence being provided? And so the main, more rigorous design that we're using there is really focused on these experiments that I've talked about. Now, of course, we'll also have other media studies that are more, providing case studies or in-depth studies on how breeding processes may have changed because of the market intelligence provided by our initiative. But those are not the ones that we're partnering on with the academic teams, because this is of a more, let's say, experimental and methodologically rigorous nature. So that's why I chose to present this particular study here. Now let's move to the second study. So this study is answering the question, if we are providing more, say, market intelligent varieties that have been identified, for which the target product profile designs were really aiming to have impacts in those 1 CGIAR impact areas. If those varieties are to be released, are these varieties indeed going to have greater impacts at the farmer and producer, or the producer and consumer level? And that requires two things. One, adoption, but also then having impacts conditional on adoption. And to answer this question, we'll be building on the behavioral intelligence work package. And just to remind you, this work package is really asking the question, what drives farmers and consumers to replace their existing varieties or to substitute their consumer products? So what is needed to get the behavioral change, to get the new technologies, to get the genetic innovation actually used on farmer fields and onto consumers' plates? And so to that extent, Work Package 3 is implementing a range of field experiments to understand the behavioral constraints to adoption. And so this includes things such as testing informational barriers, whether risk or loss aversion is influencing adoption, whether maybe limited adoption of new varieties is because of intra-household dynamics, or whether choice architecture and menu options are a barrier to enrollment, whereby maybe there's just too much choice, or maybe there's constraints in the learning process that need to be addressed through marketing activities. So those are the types of things that Work Package 3 is looking at. Now, the empirical strategy of this study that has been then developed with the team from Tufts University is to use the experiments in a way as instruments. The experiments will create differential take-up of new varieties and products. So first of all, we'll look at, what is adoption, depending on the type of experimental treatment that we introduce, but then also conditional on adoption. Now we have exogenous variation in take-up, and that can be used to evaluate impacts in these different impact areas, for instance, gender equality or nutrition or poverty. So that's the overarching empirical strategy for the second study. Now, where does work package 3 work? We are having a set of 6 experiments in different contexts, and these experiments are closely aligned, and the plan is to pull the data from the experiments into one large database, because they're all using the same or roughly the same data collection instruments, and the key indicators that we're collecting will all be the same. We're closely coordinating on this with a team of 6 studies in different locations. So here you can see that we're working in Nigeria, India, there's a study in Ethiopia, 2 in Uganda actually, and then focusing on multiple crops and traits in Kenya as well. So in these experiments, what we're all doing across the 6 sites is to compare the effects of a common producer-oriented intervention or a range of common producer-oriented interventions versus a consumer-oriented intervention that is saying, hey, maybe people are not adopting new varieties, not so much because of production-related constraints, but just because it doesn't taste good, or because they don't know in their existing cooking methods how to incorporate it. Or maybe they think that the texture just isn't going to be good, and they're hesitant to trying out and growing a new variety from the start of the season to the end of the season, and in order then to find out that it's actually not great for cooking or for consumption. So that's the rationale there. So on the producer-oriented side, we have, as a common intervention across all the countries and all the study sites, we're randomizing whether at the village level, whether farmers are provided with trial packs of improved varieties. We see that this has become a very common approach to promote adoption. And so this is something that we'll implement across all the settings to see, hey, now in which settings is it effective? And to what extent does it indeed accelerate varietal turnover? So we're providing 1 to 2 kg seed packs for farmers that they could use to cover about 5 to 10% of a hectare. So just a small portion of their plot, but large enough really to observe potentially changes with the existing varieties that they're growing. And to provide that sort of, the plan is to randomize that at the village level. Then in different countries, we're also testing different strategies to further accelerate varietal turnover over and beyond what trial packs could be doing. So there's a number of settings where we're looking at gender-specific advisories, agriculture advisories, or edutainment that might be addressing gender norms that could be a constraint to adoption. There's a location where we're looking at nudges, behavioral messaging, and SMS reminders. In other settings, we're looking at agriculture advisories that are maybe not gender specific, or climate information services. And then there's a few settings at which we're looking at crop insurance products to de-risk adoption. And so the goal of each of these interventions is to see, okay, what is the effect of this intervention compared to the effect of a trial pack? And other complementarities between those interventions. And this depends on the specific country. And also to learn more about, if you add in additional interventions along with trial packs, do you see greater impacts? Then we have currently still an ongoing discussion of what exactly is the consumer-oriented intervention that we will be doing. So for that, we need more qualitative work in order to identify what are really the key constraints around the varieties that are being promoted through trial packs. But so far, we seem to be moving towards something that involves either cooking demonstrations or edutainment for these new varieties. And so when we think of edutainment, you could think of a cooking show in which the chef takes the output from a promoted variety and in a cooking show shows, hey, this is how you can actually make it taste really nice and integrate in your meal. Or to alternatively provide a meal kit. So just like we're providing trial packs of seeds on the producer side, we're considering to provide trial packs on the consumer side and see what the effect is of just providing the end product compared to when a farmer has to go through the entire series of, or the entire season of growing that variety to see how it ends up, you know, on their plate. And then finally, the intervention will be implemented most likely around harvest time, after the trial packs have matured and are being harvested. And we're planning to target with this intervention the same sample as producer-oriented interventions. Now, also this is going to be randomized at the village level. And so in each of the countries, we'll have the same 2x2 factorial design, whereby we randomize at the village level both the producer-oriented trial pack intervention and the consumer-oriented intervention, which is cross-randomized, so that we have that 2x2 design, and so that we can look at both the main effects of the consumer versus the producer-oriented intervention, but also whether there's a complementarity between the two, or maybe whether the two more or less, you know, have similar effects and don't have any additional synergies, might even crowd each other out. So that's the design. Baseline data collection is happening late 2022 and early 2023. So there's a few countries in which we've already done baselines, a few countries that are planning to do it in the next few months. And then through the baseline surveys, we're planning to collect data on varietal preferences. Also, at the follow-up stage, perceptions and use of trial packs. At the baseline stage, we'll be looking at perceptions and use of commonly used varieties and the varieties to be promoted, since some farmers might already know about them. Then the use of targeted seeds, actually whether people have been planting it already. Also the use of other improved seeds and complementary inputs, because we expect that some improved varieties may crowd in additional inputs or investments in, for instance, fertilizers or pesticides. And some varieties may actually crowd out investments in those types of inputs. As for instance, in Nigeria, we're focusing on more pest-resistant varieties, so that could reduce the use of pesticides. And then also collecting different indicators related to the one CGIAR impact areas, for instance, income, nutrition, and women's empowerment. Then we're planning on qualitative research, really in the next few weeks, looking at what are the drivers and the barriers of varietal uptake for women and men producers and consumers. So this is more our baseline qualitative research to complement the quantitative baseline survey. And then also very importantly, to design, to finalize the design of the consumer-driven, the consumer-oriented intervention. What constraints do we see on the consumption side, and how do consumer preferences relate to adoption of these new varieties? Then, where possible, we'd like to do midline data collection immediately after the intervention season. But here, we would not be able to observe actual adoption in the subsequent season yet, whether farmers actually, after having received a trial pack, or after having been exposed to the consumer-oriented intervention, now in the next season, are they actually more likely to plant that variety? And so because of that, we will have to wait until a subsequent season, late 2023 or early 2024, before we can really identify the effects on adoption. So that is on the work package 3 experiment design. Now the media study, that one is pooling these different data sets from the different countries. And in the media study, we will really focus on 2 questions. First of all, does providing varieties that have greater potential for impact, based on our market intelligence, does this result in increased adoption? So that is a question that we will be able to answer in the short term in these first 3 years. Now, an additional question is, does increased adoption of these varieties, does that indeed improve outcomes related to the different impact areas? So nutrition, poverty, gender equality, do we see greater impacts compared to when people would be adopting varieties that have been produced more to target, say, yield gains or stress tolerance? This is a question that, building on the existing design, is more likely addressed in the longer term, hopefully in an extension of the initiative, because, yeah, we would probably not see this at the time when we're doing our surveys right after planting in late 2023 or early 2024. But hopefully, you know, we're starting something here for the longer term, and we'll be able to follow this cohort of farmers for a longer term. That's what we're envisioning. So here, final slide, some reflections on the SPIA matchmaking so far. So the collaboration with the academic teams with whom we've co-created the two studies for which I just presented this design. We have actually, it's been really nice to continue collaborating. After Nairobi, the academic teams have been participating in our study team meetings, which are happening on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. And also Anne and Jeremy, the two PhD students from the academic teams, they participated in meetings that we had last week in Washington, D.C. to finalize or to further refine and shape up the designs of these two studies. So that's been really great. And in general, we feel that the academic teams are really adding value to the study. It allows us to go in much more depth. Even during the workshop in Nairobi, it was great having, you know, time, having say an hour to just sit down with people interested in the research that you're planning and to talk it over, discuss potential explanations, challenges that might come up, risks associated with implementing the research, and think of solutions to that, and really think of, okay, how can we best design the research around answering this question? And also, it's really nice having a mix of senior faculty and PhD students, with PhD students perhaps having, you know, more time available and more bandwidth to work on any given project, but having the guidance and the expertise from the senior faculty involved. An area of reflection or where, perhaps we should look into, you know, how to strengthen the matchmaking is, I think there would be a really great value of more involving more researchers from the global south, and perhaps the academic teams that are going to SPIA matchmaking workshops could be complemented with researchers from the countries in which we actually work who bring a lot of knowledge to the table, and we would definitely want to involve them. And we would not want to have the matchmaking with academic teams from the SPIA network crowd out in a way the incentives or the opportunities for collaboration with researchers from the countries where we work. So with that, I'd like to thank all our collaborators. And here you see that the team with which we are designing this, so Bellu Haile and Carly Trackman from IFPRI are involved in this work. Valerian Pede from IRI is also closely involved in the design of the impact assessment, together with our academic teams. And then we're really happy with the support that we've been getting from our initiative lead and co-lead, Matti Demont from IRI and Vivian Pollard from SIP. Excellence in breeding, and especially Peter Koldrek for their technical advice, and then the country and gender leads for the work package 3 experiments on behavior intelligence. And you see them listed here. So yeah, with that, I come to the end of the presentation and just welcome any feedback or questions that people might have. Thank you so much. I think it's over to Travis now for initial comments.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thanks, Berber. And I may have you pull up the slides and go back a bit at some point, but and I'll also try. I'll try to keep this initial round of questions kind of short. I actually have quite a few, so it'll be good maybe even afterwards to kind of follow up. But so let me just ask a couple of questions to get things started. So I guess the first question I have is has a little bit more to do with the motivation behind the market intelligence. The kind of the general the concept of market intelligence and breeding programs. So I guess one way to think about that is that this seems like what if the seed sector was dynamic and the private seed system worked and there were incentivized seed companies that were capable and had internal capacity to search out market opportunities, that they would be doing a lot of this breeding already. They wouldn't need direction from top down. It would be more of kind of a bottom up thing. So I guess the first question, and I think I know how you'll answer this, but I just want to just make sure that it's on the table. So where's the market failure that leads to the need for market intelligence in breeding systems?
You want me to take that now, or you?
I think we should just interact just a little bit. I think that'll be a little bit easier.
Yeah. No, so excellent point. I think the way you describe it is saying, hey, market intelligence is identifying the market segments where there's the greatest market opportunity. Now here it's good, I think, for me to clarify that actually, and maybe the term market intelligence is a bit confusing there, but maybe it should be social intelligence, because really the goal is to identify in which market segments can we have the greatest social returns. So where can be the impacts? And the private sector might not have a direct incentive to really focus on those market segments. And in fact, what we see is that, the big corporates, they are breeding for the market segments where maybe the greatest economic opportunity lies, but not necessarily where the greatest social opportunity lies. And as the CGIAR, with our partners, we should be focusing on the market segments where the greatest social returns lie, not where the greatest market economic opportunities are.
Yeah. No, so that makes sense to me. I mean, I think it would be interesting as the project unfolds, it would be interesting to look for cases where private sector seed companies do have incentives to address some of the nutrition needs, for example, or even gender. Like I think you might be able to find cases like that. So the reason I think it's useful is that it might be good to kind of frame the motivation as being partly a reflection of something unique or distinctive about seed systems in, say, sub-Saharan Africa, where there are a lot of problems with like incentives actually getting through to private companies, or there's a capacity constraint, or so versus like just a straight up market failure where even if the seed sector functioned very well and was very dynamic in the private seed system, that they still wouldn't be addressing some of these goals, right? So and those are quite different ways of thinking about the motivation.
Yeah.
So and then I'll just ask a question on the studies, and again, I'll just kind of engage you a little bit, and I'll try to prioritize my questions here. I guess the study one really simple question is I didn't get how those lab in the field experiments were incentivized. Can you explain how the participants are incentivized in making these recommendations?
Yeah. So we've considered a few options. One is to use the traditional approach of providing, a significant but not too large amount of cash, and to incentivize it in that way based on the decisions that are being made. And so a given market segment, investing in a given market segment would generate some private returns but also social returns. And we'd have to think about, you know, maybe the social return would be that cash is then being given to, say a group of farmers in a location where we're working. We're still filling in the details on this. So also any input is welcome. We were also considering actually to use as an incentive whether a breeding pipeline might actually be funded, and looking for donor support to actually provide grants to organizations, and through the lab and field experiments then award some of the programs. So that would be a much bigger objective, and maybe it would take more time to, or a much bigger approach. It would take more time to materialize, but it would make the incentives much more real. And there's always a trade-off between how easy it is to implement and how, in a way, real the incentives are. And so the easiest approach, that we're just working on around now, because we would like to implement these experiments early next year. The approach that we're using now is to say, okay, let's use a cash incentive for participants, and the social return, we have to think on the right sort of beneficiary audience for that social return to be paid out. But that's how we're planning on the incentive.
No, I'm glad you're thinking. I mean, you're thinking about it, and in part because it's it's kind of a hard problem, right? Because what's the basis for my performance? So the idea is, of course, that the incentives ought to be tied to performance in the experiment, and so those who perform better get paid out more, right? Yeah. And it's just not clear to me how we should think about social returns. I mean, either maybe the social returns are given, and then it's just like basically it's an investment problem. The whole game is like an investment problem where you have these complex returns and you're trying to like recommend a portfolio, and then the weighted average return, expected return, is what is the basis for incentives. But that doesn't seem like a very useful way to structure incentives. I'm happy to. I mean, it's a tough problem. I guess the more substantive one I have on that one, and then maybe I'll pause and just open it up because I have more. But the more substantive question is about how, because study one is interesting because it raises the question about what is the baseline for breeders. How much do breeders actually pay attention to these segments, and how much do they understand about them? And it's not. I mean, I guess this is. So this will be part comment and part question. I'd love to get a reaction. Part of it is, it's not just that breeders may not have the social science background to fully appreciate the number of poor people in different segments, or the gender dimension, or nutrition, or micronutrient hidden hunger problems. It's that because it's that there's eventually these two sides have to meet between like what's technically feasible for the breeder and the level of detail and precision we have on the market segments, right? So I could imagine, for example, that the baseline here is that breeders actually, they don't know everything that social scientists know, but basically what they know matches the degree of precision or what's technically feasible in their breeding possibility. There's sort of a feasible set of things they could do. And so that's that question of like, what's the baseline among breeders? That seems like a really important like stage zero question of like, how much do they know? How much do they pay attention to those things? And is there like, if you could kind of identify a very clear space where there's missed opportunities, right? Where because their level of appreciation for these targets, it still doesn't match their technical breeding toolkit, right? That then there's like, that's exactly why there would be room for something like this to actually have an effect. And I'll just share, just in that sense, share one very specific example that I think is like this with drought-tolerant maize. So when the CIMMYT program started really investing big in drought-tolerant maize, initially the breeders, and I've talked to a lot of the breeders that were involved, Prasanna and others, that their view of this was a pro-poor technology. This is about targeting poor smallholder farmers in drought-prone areas in East Africa. And that was their target, right? So they set out with this very clear statement, this is the target. Then very soon after the program started, they realized that the only way they were going to be able to breed drought tolerance is by targeting a very specific kind of drought pressure, which is mid-season drought stress, right? So the whole breeding program ended up because of the kind of a technical feasibility constraint, the whole breeding program focused in on mid-season drought as the target. But then what happened is that changed the target beneficiaries, right? Because then they realized that, wait a second, now we're not targeting the poorest of the poor, because the poorest live in the drought-prone areas that are the severe drought-prone areas. And so you can see this on a map. I mean, I don't know if I've ever seen it mapped out quite this way, but you could see the shifting target where these were the pockets of very poor drought-prone areas in East Africa that were the initial target. And then once you overlaid what was technically feasible, all of those things shifted into, and it was no longer the poorest of the poor. It was sort of the moderately poor in somewhat drought-prone areas, because those are the places where these mid-season drought events occur more frequently. So it just seems like that, and so that's sort of the comment part, but I would be interested in your reflections on how the technical feasibility constraints and these kind of targets, how we think about squaring those and at what scale.
Yeah, no, I went all the way back as I shared the screen in presentation mode. But I think, the example that you were giving here is a great example of why it's so important that in work package 2, where the product profile design is done, that there's a combination of social scientists, of breeders, of program managers, that there's a transdisciplinary team there with different expertise coming together, because something like that could have been avoided if breeders and social scientists had been coming together at an early stage to say, hey, what's technologically feasible, and where's the opportunity that coming together from, where's the opportunity from a social science perspective versus what's technically feasible. So that has to be done really in this work package 2 in the initiative. I think specifically around our study, this is a point that we had not incorporated yet. Maybe it's good sharing that we are at some point thinking of running a similar type of experiment, but then asking breeders to invest in traits. So to make a trade-off between, say, yield gains or drought tolerance, or traits that might be preferred, say, by women, if it's having, for instance, more fodder out or a better foliage, which is good for the livestock that women are often managing, or maybe reduce labor burdens. Those types of traits, if those are, getting higher priority, if you're providing market intelligence, would be a question that we could be answering in experiments as well. But for that, we ran into the question that you're bringing up, sort of what's technically feasible, and we don't know what exactly the trade-off is at the moment between those traits. So how much more expensive is it to focus on a particular trait to desirable levels, compared to, say, focusing mainly on yield gains? We don't have that information yet. And so in the design of the experiments, we kind of, as a base, we first need to have that type of information to set the relevant trade-offs and incentives in an experiment that is about investing in traits. So that's why we move towards saying, okay, let's do the higher level picture. What actually influences the market segments that people are focusing on? But it's a good point that you're raising, and I think we should bring in a little bit more detail on what is technically feasible, and really engage that team that we have working in work package 2 in the design of the experiments, which is the plan. But yeah, we should especially focus on the technical feasibility with them. Yeah. Great point.
Yeah. So I will exercise some discipline and stop asking questions for a moment to see if anyone else has questions they want to raise.
Yeah, there's two questions that I see in the chat already. Shall we start with those?
Sure.
So the first one is from Arega Alene. I don't know if you want to come off mute and ask your question in person. Otherwise, I'm happy to read it out.
Sure, I can do that. Thank you very much for an interesting presentation. So I didn't know that already the Market Intelligence Initiative has a what you call market intelligent varieties. It is pretty fast, maybe coming from the excellence in breeding, but you can elaborate on that. It's interesting and surprising also. But the main one is about how you are going to isolate really the effects of the country-specific interventions, or those interventions that can address the adoption barriers, from the effects of the varieties themselves, because it's a mix of things, and it could be because of just those interventions you see high adoption, which now leads to high impact. But then also related to that is, what is really the reference? Can you really compare the effect of market intelligence without having a control, which is maybe using varieties that are on the same par, as improved as anything, but maybe not having that intelligence component? Then you see, okay, by introducing market intelligence, we are having this additional effect. But without that, I don't know how you do it. So if you can just...
Yeah. No, those are two great questions. On the first point, does the Market Intelligence Initiative already have varieties? No, we're not that fast. So we're really building on varieties that have come out of past breeding efforts in our empirical work for study 2. Yeah, no worries. There's no time travel happening here or anything. We do think it takes like several years for varieties that have been informed by market intelligence to actually be released. That just takes time. So what we're planning on doing is through the experiments, we're promoting a range of varieties that have been developed through past breeding efforts. And those are the varieties that we're focusing on. And those will vary in the extent to which they have a potential for impact in the market segment where they're being implemented. So coming to your second question, the country-specific interventions, those are also randomized, typically. So we'll have a pure control group in which there's no trial pack intervention as the common intervention happening everywhere, no consumer-oriented intervention, and also not that country-specific intervention. It's just status quo. But then we'll have treatment arms where the country-specific intervention is being implemented alone versus the trial packs being implemented alone. And the specific design around these country-specific interventions will vary. They are country-specific after all. But we always will have the random variation in terms of whether or not trial packs are provided and whether or not the consumer-oriented intervention is implemented, regardless of whether there's a country-specific intervention or not. We really are taking care to make sure that we can isolate in every case the effect of the country-specific versus the common treatments. And then we also have a variation in the types of varieties that are being promoted. So if we are seeing strong impacts of, say, trial packs only in market segments where we have been providing trial packs of varieties that have greater opportunity for impact, then that is telling us something about, the importance that the market intelligence is playing in generating those impacts. And we also have some variation in different countries, actually within the country, within regions in trial packs provided to farmers. So some might receive a variety with greater potential for impact. Others might be receiving a variety with less potential for impact. And that type of variation we will be able to exploit as well. And yeah, so you're raising a good point, and this is how we're planning to circumvent that. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Then I see Rashid has his hand up. Do you want to go ahead, Rashid? Or is it?
Yes, thank you very much. My question is, the randomized control trials are used mostly for internal validity, but since we're, estimating the impacts on poverty and food security and other impact areas at a large scale, we have to be confident with the numbers that we generate. So my question to you is, well, you'll be able to establish the causal link between market intelligence and adoption, but when you use those numbers to come up with the, the impact of those, impact areas, then probably we may not be able to have, the correct number of estimates. So that's my concept. So because we usually say external validity is not the quality of randomized control trials, so it's only for internal validity.
Yeah, so this is actually why we're doing the same RCT in 6 different settings with different crops, different characteristics of the target population, different varieties, really to kind of learn something about the external validity of the results. That we could say, hey, in this setting it had an impact, but in this setting it didn't have an impact. These are the characteristics of the market that might be, making this intervention particularly conducive to having an impact. So that's how we are going about the external validity concern that people have with RCTs, really implementing it at a large scale across different settings in both India, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Uganda, and Kenya. And I think this would be one of the first of its kind in the what works to accelerate varietal turnover space.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. I see a hand up by James.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Rashid. Go ahead, Rashid.
That's Rashid. Yeah, I was trying to make my question. I think, did you hear any part of my question, or was it completely cut?
Yeah, it was cut. Sorry, you didn't hear it.
No, that's fine. So the first thing was this this doubt about the discussion with Travis about whether it's private or it's, you're calling it now social market, and it's the idea. So first, thank you. It's really a great set of ideas. But isn't it on the other side that it is actually bringing more of the private sector advantage, which is that when people vote with their feet, they have to pay more attention to the demand, to what triggers more demand, and you also want to bring back some of this? Or is it purely this side of forgetting externalities, forgetting taking care of the poorest populations because you want to maximize social benefits, not private benefits? So that's one question. And the second one, which is perhaps more of a concern now for the study itself, the study 2, which is, it's a bit, so if I understand well what you call the supply side, is it choosing either one variety that was really came out of the market intelligence development versus another kind of variety? But then, so first, did I understand well? The supply side intervention is essentially one kind of variety versus another one, depending on whether it was developed by the market intelligence. That will help me clarify the question if you just answer this.
Okay, thanks for those questions. On the first one, the incentive here. Private sector would indeed have incentives to maximize or to promote varieties that would have maximal adoption, because that's, if you're thinking of a seed company, that's where you maximize the way you return. We're doing more work on, looking further into the incentives that breeding programs have. What we have kind of learned so far is that one of the key things that matters is how many varieties you have had that have been released, that have made it through the approval process at, say, the country level. Now, that doesn't depend on how many people then later adopt that variety. And it seems like breeders in the local south, in the global south, often don't get royalties from their varieties if they're adopted later. So that is limiting the incentives around, you know, is this variety then later adopted, that maybe seed companies might have. But breeding programs might not necessarily have that incentive. So I think it's really important to really better understand the incentives that are being faced. And because of that, we are currently also doing key informant interviews and literature review on how are incentives exactly structured in practice. It could also help inform for market intelligence to be more impactful. And to better align incentives. Maybe this is what would need to change. You know, maybe those royalties, for instance, are really important, and maybe we should work on the regulatory system that that helps resolve that issue. So those are actually some of the questions that are coming up now as we are looking into design of that first study of the field experiments. And that's a lot of kind of more work that is happening on the sidelines to inform the final design of the experiment. So I think you're raising an important point, and we really need to understand the incentive structure. Then the producer-oriented intervention, you're asking, you know, are we providing our control with trial packs of varieties that have not been informed by market intelligence versus the treatment we're providing trial packs of more market intelligent varieties? I think that was your question, and that you weren't sure how to interpret that. But actually what we're doing is we're randomizing whether or not any trial pack is provided. And then within the trial pack treatment, there will be variation in which exact trial pack, which exact variety they have been provided. So we will use the trial pack intervention more as, in a way, an instrument that causes variation in whether farmers are adopting new varieties that you know, have greater potential for impact. So that's the variation that to establish impacts we will be relying on. I hope that answers your question there.
Yeah. No, so with this element of answer, let me follow up a little bit. Well, I think it's a very challenging task, but it is not clear how this study 2 actually answers this bigger question of is a market intelligence approach a better way of finding what are the right inputs to provide to society, to the global south, right? So you have a very ambitious question, and the bigger scale problem is that this requires a super large scale RCT, if you wanted to, where you could in some way promote the technologies that would have been recommended and came out of the whole market intelligence development process of developing new inputs versus sort of what would have been the other inputs, right? The mental experiment that one wish he could have would be something like this. So now you're taking it down to something that is more feasible into different countries, but I think it needs a more explicit link to how do you, from the results you will get there, how do you conclude, okay, market intelligence is indeed getting us to some inputs that are better, more appropriate, and end up having more impacts or not, because the counterfactual is what kind of inputs would have been there without market intelligence. And that's the hardest part. And I think it's really, we need this explicit link. That would be very helpful. Even if you will have a sample size problem. At best, you have 6 varieties of the market intelligence versus 6 other varieties, or of course you have a sample size problem if we consider clusters as variety in that case. How do you think of this problem?
Yeah, so I think the question that we're answering is slightly different. And just because, you know, we know that the ideal experiment isn't possible. So the question that we're asking is slightly different, and it's really testing the assumption that if you're promoting these varieties, that you're getting greater adoption, and that the effects will be larger if you're focusing on varieties that have greater potential for impact. And we have variation in that because in every setting, multiple varieties are being offered. And that's often randomized between farmers, which varieties they're getting. So that's the adoption question. And then the second question is, you know, in the longer term, does this have impacts? And there, again, we're not looking at the question, okay, varieties produced by market intelligence. If we're, you know, if those are introduced, if those are launched, do you see greater impacts compared to varieties that weren't informed by market intelligence? We're really taking it a step back to make it feasible and saying, okay, let's look at the impacts of promoting these varieties, maybe using the treatments as an instrument for adoption of the varieties. So then we are asking the question, okay, what is the impact of these varieties? And then looking at heterogeneity analysis. Do we see stronger impacts for varieties or for farmers that were growing varieties that were informed by better market intelligence, or sorry, not informed by better market intelligence, but that had greater impacts or greater potential for impact as the market segments were being analyzed. So it's kind of, yeah, taking a step back. As you say, the mental experiment, the ideal one would not be feasible. We do have to, you know, once we pull the data from the different settings, we'll probably be looking at a sample of around 10,000 observations. So we do want to do still power calculations on this question to see, you know, exactly how to do it. But the truth is that for the empirical impact evaluation and testing the assumption that when you offer these better improved varieties, that also you'll see greater impacts at the farmer and consumer level. None of the centers other than IFPRI actually allocated funding to data collection for that question or for the media. And so we just have to work with whatever budget for data collection we can leverage on. So that is really constraining us, you know, because ideally we would have an extra treatment arm in which we actually say, okay, we randomize, we score varieties beforehand in terms of their market intelligence or their opportunity for impact. We score them beforehand and then we randomize whether somebody receives a variety with less potential for impact or greater potential for impact. Those types of experiments could be feasible if the budget were there, but we have to build on an existing work package that is already doing data collection in order to implement our media. So that's a real concern or constraint.
Regarding this, Barbara, is there any way, have you guys checked whether it's possible to do a kind of meta study where you look at all the impact evaluation, whether perfect or imperfect in its identification and all this, and you try to grade them backward using the same methodology, and whether that is a somewhat predictor of how well it works?
Yeah, that's still in the work plan as well. So yeah, not one of the studies that I presented here, but one of the activities that we'd like to undertake as part of the impact assessment. Yeah. Then James has his hand up.
Well, thanks. Really interesting. I had a question about how you conceptualize and define adoption in this context for your study to interventions. And I'm not going to get into the kind of nerdiness around measurement of that stuff, which I normally do. This is more of a conceptual thing. So you're bringing a treatment of, in the case of the kind of supply side, you're bringing treatments of packs of seed, right? And there's a conceptual distinction here between a variety, which is the That's the output of breeding, right? And seed, which is the vehicle for the traits that are bound up in that variety. And when you bring a farmer seed, you're bringing both of those two different treatments at the same time. You're bringing them presumably good seed produced under good quality control conditions, and you're bringing the traits that are bundled in the variety with that seed. And in some of your settings, like Travis and I are working in Uganda right now, that it's very hard to separate out the decisions that people make about the quality of particular varieties from just information asymmetries, lack of information about what is in the seed that I'm purchasing. And so I think it would be one thing to conceptualize adoption in your context as being they like the seed we gave them and they plant it again in the following season, assuming, you know, recycling of, I don't know which varieties you're talking about, but assuming there is a variety that can be planted again the following season without having to make a purchase, as opposed to observing that a farmer, having liked that trial plot, has then gone to the market and invested in buying seed of that variety. And that's a very, very different outcome than just, I got some good seed and I've decided to keep using it. So I just wondered how you've thought about that across these very different contexts that you're planning on doing this work.
Yeah, excellent points. And we had a great discussion on this when we met with the team in DC last week, that, you know, as I think it's our primary indicator for adoption, we'll be using a very simple measure of, do they plant it again in the next season? Because there is an opportunity cost of the land. So at least they liked it so much that they would grow it again. But like you're saying, that might not be because of the traits of the variety, but because they received good quality seed, and that's why they want to grow it again. And you'd actually want them to see them go to the market and purchase that specific variety for it to have an impact. So the way we're thinking about adoption is having a simple indicator, as I described, but also a series of additional measures that could, you know, about adoption. One of them actually being, do they go and purchase this particular variety again? And then there's a grading system. There's a coding system. I'm not too much of an expert in there, but you have you know, improved varieties that are coming right off the shelf that will still be in its pure form. That would be the top tier. And then if you recycle that for 1 to 3 years, then it may move down. Then if you're recycling it longer than that, then, you know, the quality starts becoming questionable. So we're also looking into using that grading system to qualify and to kind of more get into the concepts that you're measuring. That's it's not just the genetic composition that matters, but it's also the quality of the seed, and the seed as that vehicle for the traits. And thinking of, you know, the two need to be separated out as we're looking at adoption.
Yeah, Neil.
Thanks, Barbara. I think Niels is next.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, got confused with too many devices. I'd just like to follow up on 2 parts. Oh, first, I want to show also my appreciation for the study on the behavioral ones. But I think we do far little to that because we do too little. We don't have so much experience. We don't discuss it a lot. But I will still be, and I can't say much either. But I would still be very interested in how it moves forward. On the other one, I think that what colleagues have already pointed out, these ideas about this variety distribution with your experiment, at least that's something which is important to present when describing this, because as Rashid has pointed out, that's the link to the overall question. And I had thought actually that your ideal approach of randomizing these different scored varieties would be something you can implement, but apparently it is not. So then, I mean, the danger is that if you get the varieties from your colleagues in work package 2 and you score them subsequently, your distribution of the different types of varieties might make analysis quite tricky. I'm not sure if it is not possible to sort of engage with them and see, well, to understand things better, can we have a discussion? And the other point James mentioned about adoption of, then once you talk about going to the markets, of course, the seed availability in the markets for the different types of seed might also be very different and then influence your outcome. And again, making your 10,000 observations sort of seem tight with all this variation you might get. Just observations here, but I mean, of course, it's really interesting to see what we go.
Thank you, Niels. So on the first question, we depend on the team in work package 3. Now, fortunately, there's overlap in the team. So we can steer things towards, what is needed, and there's alignment between how do we best design the experiments from the work package 3 perspective versus what's best for the impact assessment. There's some alignment happening there. And we're meeting actually next week in person, and I hope that can be an opportunity to further strengthen that alignment. On the second question, seed availability is important. Yes, very great point. So what we are doing is we're focusing on varieties for which we know that they will be available in the market. Varieties that are fairly new in the market, people are not using it at a great extent yet, but the supply is there because that's a prerequisite. What we're doing here is not so much focusing on the seed system side. Really, the focus is more on the behavioral side or on the demand side. What does it take for people to adopt these new varieties? So having seed availability is kind of a prerequisite for a variety to be included in the study. That's a very important one. Yeah.
Berber, can I ask just as we close, one last question about matchmaking?
Yeah.
So, because I'd be curious, so it sounds like the way this works is that SPIA covers the cost of the first date. You mentioned the speed dating, right? So SPIA pays for the first date. And then what happens? Like how does research funding happen after in the courtship and marriage stage? Who's paying for what?
Yeah, there was no real bride price or dowry provided. No, so SPIA facilitated the matchmaking. It's the initiatives that are paying for the data collection. It's the researchers that are coming in with their own research time, for instance, using their university funding. And then also SPIA, for instance, sent out a list of potential funding opportunities that could be applied for and the conditions associated with that. So there's still some facilitation in trying to help generate additional funds for these projects. So yeah, that's a little bit of who is paying for what. Yeah.
Thanks, Berber. So that brings us to the top of the hour. Yeah, Mina, do you want to wrap things up?
I don't have much to add. Thank you all for contributing so much to this discussion. Thank you so much, Berber, for a really interesting presentation and also for providing some input on how the matchmaking has worked for you. It's great to see that you're moving ahead so well with your projects. Thank you all.